Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Just to let you know, I might have to sign off a little earlier today. I've got a call with those who were on the call last week know that I'm dealing with some stuff with my dad, which is ongoing and as yet not really resolved, but he's hanging in. He's hanging in there. Um, so, as you know, those of you who have been, looks like most of you have been participating in some of these Zoom calls. Um, One way to encapsulate what I'm talking about in teaching is um, discovering, exploring, seeing the ways in which all of the array of ways that we have to make sense of what's going on here, to conceive and describe and characterize and categorize reality. And we have many ways, don't we, with words and language and concepts. That things that we basically, more or less take for granted as part of kind of, you could say, consensus reality. Um, when we investigate our experience, we can discover the ways in which our experience actually contradicts those consensus ideas in some pretty profound ways. And so I wanted to focus on one of those, you could say, kind of assumptions that we carry around as humans. Even that's an assumption that we're humans, incidentally. I don't know what we are ultimately. Um, but the notion of there being bounded things, of there being boundaries, is just pervades so much of our kind of common everyday understanding and assumptions, really, about what's going on here. And so I just want to explore that a little bit, and then we can discuss it. So let's take, arguably, a fundamental idea that we carry with us, most of us, that there's a boundary somewhere between what we think of as ourselves and the world. You could say the subject, the fundamental kind of subject object duality. So if you will, right now, I just invite you to feel yourself, to feel your own existence, your own being. That sense of sort of being here, being localized as you, the you that's listening, the you that's perceiving this moment, the you that's participating in this experience of that we're having right now, that you're having. But just feel yourself, your own being. It's a felt sense, isn't it, of life, of your own aliveness, of you. And I'll introduce a kind of a spatial sort of metaphor, which in some ways isn't relevant, but can be useful to play with. So to just feel as if feel yourself, and then venture out, if you will, to whatever you imagine to be the end of you, where somehow your boundedness becomes apparent, the end of you becomes apparent, the edge of you. And see if you can find that. See if you can actually locate a boundary, a line sort of demarcating. Well, now I've come to an end, and whatever is not me, the world, comes into view. See if you can locate a boundary. I think for many people that the sort of belief or the feeling might be that the boundedness is something to do with the skin line. The body is somehow some sort of boundary, separating self, separating the subject from the world, separating the self from other. So if that happens to be the case for you, that you feel somehow that the body represents some sort of boundary, feel what you call forget about the body as a thought, but as experience, feel what you call the body as experience. Any ideas that we have about a body and being in a body, so to speak, or having a body, are based on experience, right? Everything's based on experience. So feel the experience. Don't feel your body. Feel the experience that you refer to as a body, and see if, as experience, there's any edge to the body, that there's any end to the body, that there's any boundary, and there's actually any boundedness to the body. And if you say or you sense that there's a boundary there, what's a boundary made of? Feel the boundary and see if you can find an edge to the boundary itself. You know, whatever it is that's being experienced right now, whatever is being perceived, the sound of my voice, for example, you know, there's this perception, we would call it a perception of sound, or the perception of the ideas that are being shared with you right now, right? And we, again, kind of conventionally speaking, we have this idea of the perception kind of as this bounded thing. And we, the one who is perceiving the perception, the thought, the idea, the feeling, the experience of this event right now, or of the body that we're exploring, or boundaries, or anything that's being experienced right now, perceived. Can you actually find any boundary between what you might think of as you, the perceiver, and the thing being perceived, the experience, the sound, the light, the color, the texture, whatever's being experienced? Is there any boundary? It's very kind of odd in a way, and remarkable, that we can have this sense of, yeah, there's me and then there's my experience, and they're not the same thing. And there's a sense of being able to kind of distinguish subject from object. Like, oh yeah, I'm here and the sound's not me. Like, I can hear the sound, right? There's that sense of two things, right? The perceiver and the perceived. But this is what's so interesting, is that go and look and see if you can find a border there between the perceiver and the perceived, a boundary separating the two. What is that boundary? Is there a boundary? Or is there just edgelessness, seamlessness, boundarylessness? Really just a field of perceiving, you could say, a field of knowing, a field of feeling, without a feeler and something being felt, without a perceiver and something actually being perceived that's separate, but just actually perceiving, knowing, feeling. You know, you can explore boundaries, presumed boundaries, not only between what you think of as yourselves or imagine to be yourself and experience, but you could take any experience. Let's say you're feeling, you describe your feeling as, um, well, I don't know, anyone give me one word of what you might be feeling right now as an experience, an aspect of your experience, any description that you had, if you had to characterize an aspect of your experience right now.
Presence.
Presence, calm. So you could take that experience or any, it could be a sense of confusion, or it doesn't matter what the experience is, but let's say presence. And where does the experience that's being described as presence, is there any boundary to it? Is there any point where presence comes to an end and it's no longer presence? In other words, it becomes something else. Because otherwise, how do we have discrete things? They, in a sense, have to be sort of at least seemingly bounded in some way, right? So there's this thing called presence, and then there's everything around it that isn't presence. But you could take any experience and do the same thing, explore where are the boundaries, where are the edges to presence as a feeling, as a felt sense. Oh, like now I've come to the end of presence, and now beyond that horizon, beyond that line, there's no more presence. You can't find it. You can't find the edge of presence. Or if you feel afraid, you can't find the edge of fear, like where fear goes away, where it's no longer. It's not clear. It's not so clear cut. Not clear cut at all, actually, which is astonishing. Because again, language suggests discrete, bounded phenomena, doesn't it? Look at the visual field right now, and you're sitting in your room, let's say, wherever you are in your homes, or wherever you're located, and you're seeing all what would typically conventionally be described as the objects, the visual objects in the field of vision, right? I mean, a table, chair, television, picture, wall, light switch, you know, garbage can. I mean, just naming objects, right? Boy, I can just see them like. And there's this assumption of separation, of edges, of boundaries. But I can look again and invite you to look and see if you can find any lines anywhere. Or is there just a seamless continuum visually that might be showing up and be described as discrete objects, but again, from this other perspective, you can't find discrete objects. You find a field. You find, and again, what you think of as yourself as the perceiver of the field is also indistinguishable from the field of light. You see? Here's another fun boundary, presumed boundary that we have, again, that language suggests that you can explore, and your exploration can turn that assumption upside down on its head, which is the assumption that we have that there's something called a past, a present, and a future, that there's time, and that there's these categories, like there's this thing called the past that happened before, whatever before is, and then a thing called now, and then a thing that hasn't yet happened that's called the future. Well, can you actually, when you look in your experience right now, can you find a clear boundary between now and something called the future? Like where now now ends and something called what's not now begins, you know? If you say there's like a flow of time, you know, past, present, and future, is there any boundary line anywhere? Is there any boundary between what was an instant ago and what is here now and what will be in the next instant? There's absolutely no boundary that can be found. Absolutely no dividing line. So that investigation, which takes all of a few instants to just look and see, there's no boundary to be found between what we call past, present, and future, calls into question that entire conceptual framework of there being a past, present, and a future. It may have utility from a language and a communication standpoint to talk about past, present, and future as if they actually exist, but they can't be found in our actual experience, which is very curious, isn't it? You can't find past, present, and future in your experience. Because again, you can't find lines of demarcation separating those categories of phenomena, temporal categories. You can't find the line. So is there time that we divide up as past, present, and future? Look and see. And feel the way in which there's just nothing but the most radical openness and intimacy with everything. There's absolutely nothing standing between what you think of as you and the field of experience. There's absolute experience touching experience with nothing in the way. There's nothing in the way. There's no walls anywhere. There's nothing but complete openness. You could say complete vulnerability in the sense of us, the experience of what we think of as ourselves and the experience of life in complete indivisible communion with one another. There's no place again where there's no gap between the two. You know, there's a nice shield that stands somehow between me and the world. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. There's just complete immersion. But it's not really one thing immersed in another thing. It's just, immersion is just a word, but it suggests something being immersed in something else, right? Like I'm going to immerse myself in the water, but there's just life. You could say just life immersed in itself, reality immersed in itself, experience completely immersed in itself.
Sometimes it feels like thoughts get in the way of that immersion. For example, I've had times when I'm riding my bike
Mhm.
and there's deep in thoughts about something, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, I missed a huge section of the path
Mhm. Right.
as I was immersed in thoughts.
Right. And that is typically, Pam, the way you'll hear, say, meditative traditions kind of talk about that somehow, that the thoughts are functioning as a kind of obstacle to really being with things, being immersed in things, recognizing that immersion. And I understand that way of describing it. But let's look at that for a moment and say, so there you are, you're walking, you're riding your bike, you're in your car, and then there's what we would characterize as going off into some daydream of wondering about something or fantasizing about something or worrying about something or perseverating about something or just imagining something, right? Thought. So that is just another moment of the way this immersive reality can show up. It's not anything wrong with it. It's not a problem. It's not an obstacle. It's just another flavor of life.
Because then there's all of a sudden that seamless shift into like, oh,
Right,
now I'm not immersed in the thought, or,
right,
you know.
right. and 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 what's tricky about all of this, or can be a little bit sort of misleading when, say, when I'm talking about this, is I'm doing a little kind of guided inquiry, as we were just doing and are doing, to sort of point out, invite people to notice the way in which boundaries can't be found, right? And it can feel as if, oh my God, I'm like waking up to realize I'm going kind of into another space of recognizing the boundless, seamless nature of things, right? And then I can maybe find myself in another moment imagining there being boundaries, and but when I'm pointing out something like that, remember this, and that is that I'm not actually talking about a kind of a particular state, or that is sort of, that I one might say is recognizing that there's no boundaries, as a state contrasted with other states where we're imagining boundaries. Because the state where we're imagining there are boundaries is also without boundaries. So I'm really pointing out that there just aren't boundaries, period. And there are not boundaries even when you are thinking thoughts about there being boundaries. Does that make sense? It's like it just may have a different feel and flavor to it that we might describe as, less open and less spacious and less intimate, and feeling maybe more contracted and divided. And we could use words to characterize what it feels like maybe when we're imagining there being boundaries, as we typically do imagine. But that the boundless, seamless nature of things is just the nature of things, no matter the particular state that we might seem to be in. And one of the powerful things about taking a little time to notice that and recognize that, like we just did, is that it undercuts, it has the function kind of sort of remedially undercutting the very entrenched sort of belief and perspective and assumption and presumption that, oh yeah, I live as a bounded creature in a bounded world, having experiences that are separate from me and encountering other beings who are separate from me. I mean, this is just like consensus reality, right? That there's subjects and objects. And, we could say that one of the ways reality can be experienced is as separate things, for sure. And it's not really untrue in a certain way. It's like a perspective that from within that perspective, it's has its own reality. And then there's this other perspective that I'm talking about, which not only can bring forth a different kind of felt sense of things, a different has its own sort of flavor. And you could say the flavor is one of great intimacy, one of great openness, one of great freedom. One way that's really powerful, I think, to kind of see and to emphasize is that when we're experiencing difficult moments, things that we describe as difficult circumstances or feelings, let's say, it often feels, and I know I've talked about this before, it feels like this event, this experiential event that I don't like you were talking, a couple calls ago about the loss of your beloved pet and the grief. And it's like, from the conventional kind of perspective, it's like the event is happening to you, right? And again, that's a perspective, and it's one way we experience it. It's like, wow, this is happening to me. And yet that becomes very interesting in such moments, if one's so inclined to explore that presumed boundary, let's say, between the event and you. And it can be discovered that a clear boundary can't be found, which can really change sometimes in dramatic ways what that event is like, in a sense, like how it's the sense of it, that recognizing that what we call this thing happening to me from another perspective is simply experience immersed in experience. In other words, just experience. Where is the sense of that being something that could harm me? There's no, where is the, there's, it's in a sense, this is a great paradox, is that by recognizing our radical vulnerability to everything, because there's nothing, there's no way to protect ourselves, quote unquote, from all that's happening experientially because of this full immersion. So it's complete vulnerability. And yet that turns out to be the most radical invulnerability, because there's nothing that can harm us because we are everything. There's not someone to be harmed from this perspective. It's like the waves can't harm the ocean. They are the ocean. There's not one thing harming another thing. There's just this. And this is, from the perspective I'm talking about, has no, it's not a this and a that. It's not this experiencing that. It's just this. Period. Always. No matter how it might be looking. And one way to awaken us to the seeing of that, the recognition of that, is to do what we were doing, which is to explore the presumption of boundaries and begin to see, like, holy shit, it's like I can't find boundaries. That's really interesting. I mean, I don't know about you, but I can't. If you found a boundary, tell me about it, but I can't find them. So that's very interesting. That has like a different implication to it, that I can't find a boundary. It's pretty wild.
It brings to mind kind of what you were saying earlier about the seamlessness of like time.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of how some people will say, well, look, here's a rotten apple. This is proof of time because it used to be, you know,
Mm-hmm.
a whole fine apple, and now look, it's brown and it's shriveled. So that's like proof. But from, listening to you, it made me think of like, you know, that was seamless. I mean, the aging of the apple, there's no boundaries there. And it's
Yeah.
not proof because I can't say like there's this dividing line of, oh, this was a healthy whole apple and now it's rotten.
Right.
There's that
Exactly.
whole progression.
I mean, I've been contemplating death quite a bit of late because of what my father's facing, and which is very, I mean, we're always facing our own mortality, but it's really up for him. And so just as your example with the apple, our birth is also our being born is also our dying. In other words, it's a continuum, isn't it? There's no clear line where birth, youth, adolescence, adulthood, old age, death, if it goes that long for us, if we're lucky enough, um, there's no clear demarcations anywhere. So our being born is also our eventual passing away. It's absolutely seamless. You could say we start to pass away the moment we come into existence, if we think of it in a temporal kind of way as a life stream.
And the thing you're saying too about, we can say, oh, there are no boundaries, they're
Mm-hmm.
seamless. But what you're suggesting too is to actually, look, investigate, and try to find boundaries. And that to me makes all the difference.
It makes all the difference in the world, Pam. I mean, it might be intriguing as an idea, and then, so much so that it encourages one to investigate, but ultimately, you know, what I'm my what I'm sharing is very empirical in that sense. It's like, be a scientist, look empirically at your own experience, and I'll even say that, be an experiential scientist. Look at your own experience and see what it tells you about its nature, because many of the concepts that we have about it are misleading, uh, in terms of what they're suggesting, how they're suggesting reality is, and the boundaries and the bounded nature of us and things, and the ideas of being a subject in a world of objects, and a self and an other. These are, when you look at experience itself, you can see the way in which those are abstractions that don't hold up under scrutiny. So that the scrutiny is not an intellectual one, it's an experiential one. Absolutely. And it can serve to undercut those conventional assumptions about the way things are. And um, whether we're talking about time or space or subject object distinction, those are pretty fundamental ones that most of us are just cruising along, like, just, oh yeah, this is the way it is. It's like, well, have you stopped to look? And I've had a career as a scientist, as a researcher, in times of my life, less so right now, but um, it's one of the things I love about it, as both a practice, science as a practice, and a metaphor for a way of relating to our experience. And that is that science, when it's operating in its best, best way or optimal way, it's about looking and seeing what's there rather than assuming that we know what's there. So science, I often say to my students when I'm teaching about research, is science doesn't give a shit what you think is true. Doesn't give a shit about our opinions and our beliefs. It just says, let's look and see. Like, do you think this particular treatment is effective? Okay, well, fine, you can think whatever you want, but let's look and see what happens when people undergo this treatment, for example. And science, I'm not going to belabor it, but it has its own limitations that have to do with different things. It can't really handle the complexity of this very well. It's impossible ultimately to really measure things, because things are beyond measurement, and yet science relies on measurement. So there's limitations. It almost always overgeneralizes, because it's, again, trying to science, when it comes to human science, doesn't do a good job dealing with individual differences. So we'll look at a group of people and say, how do they respond to this treatment, let's say, and like empirically. But it can't account very well for the fact that every single person is different and is having a different, distinct response. So because of that, it becomes impossible to do what science would hope to be able to do, which is make some prediction. Like, oh, if a given person undergoes some set of phenomena, they encounter certain phenomena, how's that going to affect them, right? Science would be human science, like psychology wants to try to understand those things, but and then make predictions like, well, if you expose a person to this kind of therapy, then you can expect to see this kind of outcome. But those predictions are so crude, because you're going to respond, let's say, to a given treatment in a way that's like no other person, because of your unique nature. And science isn't very good at accounting for that. But to
And
come back,
it goes along with what you're saying about the boundaryless. I mean, science is tough without boundaries. I mean, there's nothing discrete. I mean, even like a shot of insulin has, a microscopic amount, a little bit less or more than some other person would get, or it's just all watery.
right, it's not as precise as it might like to imagine that it is. And it's kind of like, but it works well enough in certain respects. Like, I mean, pi is a great example I sometimes use as a wonderful metaphor for the the unfathomable nature of this, how you can't get to the bottom of what it is ultimately. And pi is, what is pi? Well, it's 3.14, you know, and then it goes, you never get to the end of pi. There's no end to it. And because of that, you can't actually say what pi is. So it's a beautiful metaphor, isn't it? You can't, it's sort of, someone would say, well, it's good enough, and enough so that people can use it and as part of their scientific work or their engineering work or whatever. It's a useful tool, right? And it's kind of like language, like it's a useful tool for me to say, yeah, I'm, how you doing, about how your dad's doing right now? And I might say, well, it's difficult, so that conveys something about my experience. But it's kind of like, what is pi? It's 3.14. It's like, it doesn't really get to the depths of what my experience is any more than saying pi is 3.14 really tells us exactly what pi is. Does that make sense? It's like, I can't get to the end of what my experience is. Now I finally got to the final number of pi of my experience. And here it is. This is what it is. I mean, just think about how profound that is, that you can't get to the final number to sort of characterize or quantify or articulate what this moment is. Anything about it, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what reality is. I mean, any aspect of it, you come up with the same unresolvable indeterminacy. You don't get to the end of it. And not getting to the end of it is getting to the end of it. Is discovering that there is not an end. That's its own radical kind of freedom. Because that also is unbounded, isn't it? It's unbounded and limitless, that there is no end. There's no finality. There's no final conclusion. It's open-ended.
And it's also random too.
Yeah, I don't, randomness is not a word I typically use, in part because I sometimes joke, that randomness is like one way of saying, I don't know, like it's a way of saying, I don't know why it's happening. Well, it's random, it doesn't seem like it has a particular purpose behind it, let's say. But I don't really know. I mean, is the question of like, is what's going on here, like the universe in a cosmic sense or a transcendental sense, is it purposeful? Is it headed somewhere? I'm not going to draw, that's too philosophical for me to try to, I'm not going to claim that I know that, because I don't. It seems like it has certain kind of qualities of kind of curiosity and a sort of an insatiable thirst for experience. Like it sort of seems, I'm giving it certain qualities, maybe I shouldn't give it, but it feels that way. It feels like it's got this relentless curiosity about itself, exploring its nature, tasting its nature, reveling in its nature, attempting to understand its nature. So, if I were to ascribe a purpose to it, I would say that's its purpose, is to just know itself more and more and more and more fully, more and more and more intimately, more and more sensitively, more and more completely, multidimensionally. And that's a never-ending, beautiful, delicious undertaking, in my experience, that exploration. Isn't that just extraordinary that you could take what you think of as yourself and even if you imagine yourself as a bounded creature, a self with a kind of an edge around you, just go out from the self to whatever you imagine to be not self. And when do you ever arrive at an end to yourself? Don't. Maybe it seems like, spatially speaking, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier, like way out there at the farthest reaches of my being. I can't quite tell what's there. And yet there's no clear end, like, here it is, I got to the end, and now the world begins. Just like you are the world. Literally. We are everything that's perceived, everything that's experienced, everything that's encountered. And I say that just because I can't seem to find a boundary between myself and anything that's encountered. So for all intents purposes, I am everything that's encountered.
It's always perplexed me when scientists will say there are billions and billions of stars in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always like, billions? I mean, that like defines how many. I mean, you can't know how many. So
Mm-hmm.
even to say billions gives it like a number. It has, it just always astonishes me. When I think of the universe, I think of, total infinity, and my
Mm-hmm.
mind like locks up, even trying to imagine it. So when I hear that there's some like, limits around it, I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, well, what's on the other side of that boundary,
Right. Right. Yeah.
Hey, John, it's interesting when you were talking about time. So this morning I was doing something and it was neat watching, this or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
um, kind of morph or shift or become. I had to think about, put things into the concept of time for the day, and it was just so apparent how the boundlessness of whatever this is, just and how unbelievably um, um, amazing it is that it shifted into the conceptual framework of time to strategically
Mm-hmm.
make a
Make a
plan,
plan. Yeah.
and then it just relaxed back into itself. So then and that's where it can become so clear when you have the ahas that there's an apparent. So then Chris is the seeker looking for, searching for God and
Mm-hmm.
liberation, and then that's where you have that aha, and it's just so funny because um Chris, it's so apparent in that moment that um you know whatever this is can only know itself, and is apparently seeking. There is no Chris seeking. There never was. It was just this um um like yeah, there was never a separate something seeking for liberation or the truth. It was always the truth. Only the truth can look for itself.
Exactly.
And yeah.
Exactly. It can feel like, and get,
Yes. Oh yeah.
and get articulated as somebody's looking for God or truth or freedom, right?
Mm,
Absolutely. I mean, that's the, you know, um, here I am, an individual, and I'm in a kind of a relationship with an other, a great other, a divine other, a sacred other, and so on.
mm,
But it's like, I am that sacred other. That sacred other has become all things,
mm,
including what I think of as the body and the mind and the self and the personality and all of the whole body mind organism, if you will, is simply the absolute creative energy
mm,
of as I like to call it, the shining forth,
mm,
the the display
Mhm.
of this, the display of this.
Mhm.
So that turns the whole thing upside down on its head, right? Because it's like, what in the world? It's like, it is, the proverbial wave looking for the ocean, like,
Mhm.
and all the while it's been nothing but the sea.
Mhm.
And wow, what a thing to remember that, to see
Mhm.
that what was it? I think it was Meister Eckhart said, something like, God is searching for herself with her eyes. It's like God's looking for God,
Mhm.
which is a funny thing.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. I was thinking about it this morning. I was sitting there, and it used to be as if there was my orientation to being was more so as there was a higher
Hmm.
um something, that was like a movement down towards, kind of like overseeing me or something, or
Hmm.
watching us here on the earth. And
Hmm.
that's when the shift is more that's where you can experience the act. When there's that shift, it's the ground of being is there's no longer a, like a felt sense of there's something above looking down that's separate. It's like that the ground of being is this, and it's kind of just, there is, like we've been talking about, no more lines, no more separation, just, and this is it here.
And
Not
there's
it's
all
just
these and there's all
this
these wonderful hints, throughout the traditions, of just what you're saying, that are, I sometimes wonder what some of the traditions make of those hints, because they're so explosive when you really consider them. Like, there's one in the Bible that says, the kingdom of heaven is spread across the earth, but few have eyes to see it.
Mm,
It's like,
mhm,
wow, the kingdom of heaven is spread across the earth.
mhm.
That's really different. That this is the kingdom of heaven.
Mm,
This, just like this moment,
mm,
it's the kingdom of heaven,
mm. Yeah,
and it always is.
yeah. How can it not be?
How could it
Yeah.
not be? How could it not be? It's only an idea that would tell us it isn't. And but again, we can investigate experience and say, well, can you find two things? And if there is such a thing as called the kingdom of heaven, then this is it, because there's just one thing.
Mhm,
There's one ocean of existence, or one ocean of reality.
mhm,
And we can feel that. You can feel that now. Feel that there's just one thing here. Call it life, call it reality. And it shows up as all these seeming pieces, all these discrete phenomena. It's an amazing, it's the magic show. It shows up as all this distinction and differentiation, right? Each one of us seemingly distinct expressions of that singularity, right? I mean, I can only see two images right now, Chris and Pam, on the screen. And it's like, I mean, it couldn't be more distinct, right? In terms of all the different ways we think about humans being distinct, right? But what are each of you made of? What am I made of? What am I? What am I? What am I made of? And well, in a very real sense, when you find what you're made of, or you find what any experience is made of, you find what everything is made of. And it's that same thing. It's made of something that can't ultimately be said any more than you can say what the final number of pi is, because I can't get to the bottom of my own being. I sometimes joke that there's so much emphasis in life, and there's a multi-billion dollar life improvement industry, self-improvement industry, and psychology and spirituality are very much intertwined with that industry, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it's like, what about exploring what life actually is, rather than assuming it needs to be improved? Like, what is life? Well, again, you don't get to the bottom of that question which is, you don't find it, which is the finding. You can't pin it down. And it's like, oh my God, that's amazing. I can't tell you what life is. And yet here it is, showing up as all this event, all this phenomena, all this apparition, all this unbelievable complexity and intelligence and intercorrelations between these phenomena. And it's just, right, I could go on and on and on. I mean, it's
you know, it's interesting. Both you and Chris, it seems to me, was talking about the shift from I am that to that I am.
mm-hmm.
It's sort of a shifting away from the I into the wholeness that include then includes you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we can enter through the doorway of that discovery in lots of different ways. But yeah, it's like it feels to me often like a dance of like dancing perspectives, almost like dancing, you know, because there's the dance of like, I'm in a world and I have a life in the world, you know, as an individual. I can feel the sense of that, the beauty of that, the profoundness of that, the profoundness of my relationships with others. It's extraordinary. You know, I'm thinking about my father a lot, of course, and, you know, the dance of that relationship. And yet, experientially, I only know my father as experience. And so my father as an experience, whether that's my thoughts of him, the visual images of him, the memory of him, the touch of him, physical touch of him, all of it is experience. And so as experience, I'm not separate from my father. There's no separation. He is me in the vaster sense of me, in the boundless sense of me. And so again, it's kind of a dance. It's both of those are true in a sense. And what this is ultimately, it doesn't really land anywhere in particular. It doesn't sort of arrive at, this is the one and true perspective. It's kind of just, it seems to be very playfully popping in and out of perspectives. And, oh, what's it like from this perspective? What's it like from this perspective? What's it like from this perspective? And I am introducing a kind of an underrepresented perspective in the panoply of perspectives that exist in life. And this is the perspective of the boundaryless nature of this and the singular nature of this. And it has the feel of it to me as kind of the most primal kind of perspective, the root, in a sense. Hi,
What
Karen.
you're saying, hi. The example of the experience with your father really made me think a lot, because I think in every family, we all experience each other differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there was in fact a unified father or a unified sister, we would all have the same experience of that person.
Mm-hmm.
And yet what I have certainly found in many discussions that I've talked with others is that we all experience people differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're really bringing ourselves to that
Mm-hmm.
and our own experience to
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And where we want to think that we're experiencing the truth, but you know, why is my truth different from my brother's truth, or different from, you know, and so really it's us that's having the experience.
And what's really wild, and I talk about this sometimes, is that like, you know, you're walking outside right now, and so I can see that there's some blue in the sky, there's some clouds, and let's take those two colors of white and blue that you can look up and experience, right? And you can say, well, I see some blue, I see some white clouds, And I can look at my own seeming reference point for those experiences, but I actually have zero knowledge about what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
I don't know what blue is like for you. This is the weird thing about language, because it suggests a consensus reality, because we have words and we can seemingly, I know what you mean when you say I see blue sky, but I don't actually know what you mean. I don't know what it's like for you to experience anything. If you tell me I feel happy, I feel sad, I go back to my own reference point. But in a sense, we exist in a universe of one. There's nobody else there, and that just feels to be the case. And it's extraordinary, that I don't know anything but the view from here. You can share with me your view, and I love sort of hearing from the views of others. There's something about it that's really cool. But I can't get inside there to know what your universe is like. I only know you in my universe.
Yeah, and to stretch the metaphor even farther, they've shown that people really do see things differently. There's things like synesthesia, where some people hear colors, and animals have completely different ways of seeing things.
And I think, and what's just to kind of as a brief aside, because I was talking about research earlier, that one of the challenges of research or understanding the human experience from a research standpoint is, if I want to know how you, Karen, are experiencing your life, and I'm trying to research that as part of my study, how can I ever know how you experience life? I don't have the tools to know. There are no tools to know how you experience life. I would have to basically impose some abstraction of understanding about how Karen experiences the universe. You are the only one that knows, which is extraordinary to consider.
Doesn't that sound like a little bit of separation then? Like Karen has her experience, you have your experience.
Well, from the perspective of non-separation, Karen doesn't know if I exist. She only knows her experience. She lives in the universe that is seemingly populated by people, places, and things. But experientially, again, there's just a seamless field of experiencing. There's not.
Yeah, well, I think we've all heard stories of people who were poor but had no conception that they were poor. For example, they were poor from an absolute stance, say, out externally, but they had no. And then conversely, you have people who are, in absolute terms, quite wealthy or rich,
right,
and yet have an impoverished view.
Well, and that points to Chris's earlier comment about talking about the apple, and that it's really a continuum. And so all these notions of poor and rich those are arbitrary. Like, at what point do you leave poor and enter not poor? Or what point do you leave rich and enter not rich? It's a continuum. Yeah. So everything is a continuum. There's not discrete, but language suggests discrete categories of phenomena. But the discrete categories cannot be found, both logically and experientially, which is interesting. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, Ed, you were going to say something.
But if you take it to this conclusion about we all have our different experiences, it's your experience that people in your experience are experiencing something other than you are. That's part of your experience.
Right. I don't actually know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe you don't exist.
Right, but you exist in my experience, and
seemingly,
and the existence includes this lack of knowledge of what you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting because, again, so much of what I'm doing is sort of looking at experience, like playing with the hypothesis that experience is what's primary. Again, experientially, we don't experience a world, we experience experience. We don't experience other people as autonomous creatures, we experience experience. So, I mean, who knows? You know, we could speculate, like, metaphysically or philosophically, like maybe you live in a universe with one being, and it's not populated by 7 billion other people, the world that you live in. It may seem like it. And then maybe each of those 7 billion people maybe each of us exists in a separate universe of sorts. Who knows? Who knows?
Some people, in my experience, report the ability to experience their other people's experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, maybe they do. Who knows?
I think that's, you know, what we're talking about here is that, you know, the paradox of, you know, and you'll quote it often, John, you know, the Buddhist, you know, emptiness is form, form is emptiness, and that it's that, you know, the apparent, you know, existence of me as a separate person and existence of you as a separate person doesn't exist without one another. Like, I don't exist. This Chris is a story and a concept and all that does not exist
Mm-hmm.
without the other the perception of John.
Mm-hmm.
John's apparently different from Chris, but then when we inquire into that, we don't. There's no lines. There's no separation.
Mm-hmm.
So that you can, you know, the mind can't grasp that, but it's, you know, we can kind of get close to that in a sense. So
well, even experientially, to come back to the primacy of experience,
mm-hmm.
and to just say something about the emptiness form dance, is that if you look at this moment, feel this moment,
Mm-hmm.
in a very real sense, not abstract, in a very real sense, the moment never comes into form. Because the apparent arising of its form, of its shape, of its texture, of its flavor, the arising of it is the disappearing of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the shapeless nature of this, the formless nature of the apparent form is,
Mm-hmm.
is radically formless in the sense of its dynamism, in the sense of its impermanent nature.
Mm-hmm.
So we could say that, I don't know really much about Kabbalah, but I once heard that talking about the 4 elements, that the earth element is the sort of delusion, because earth suggests the stability of things, like the form nature of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's delusion in the sense of it definitely looks like it's formed, like it's holding still, like it's stable. But when you investigate the experience of this moment, you find nothing but radical instability, radical formlessness that
Mm-hmm.
shows up as apparent form. That's the dance of emptiness, always appearing like something.
Mm-hmm.
It always has the implication of form.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's like a constant tease. It's like, here's the form, but it never really comes into complete shape, because it's
Mm-hmm.
just vanishing, vanishing, vanishing,
Mm-hmm.
vanishing, vanishing, and yet appearing,
Mm-hmm.
appearing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the form, and the emptiness dancing as form, and form always being empty of form.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like, that's insane, but it's actually our experience. Feel your experience.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like it's got a kind of solidity and a sort of stability to it, but does it really? Look at it carefully.
And another clue is, whenever we try to impose form on the formless,
Mm-hmm.
conceptually, we run into walls, we run into contradictions,
Mm-hmm.
we run into unexplainability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mhm. There's a Buddhist psychologist I like. Have you ever heard of Miles Neal?
No, I don't know that name.
He works with the Tibetan tradition and Dalai Lama and everything, but he calls what we're talking about here, that's a neat, he calls it quantum view.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
The Buddha's teaching of what we're talking about. But I mean, what Ed was saying about kind of like people being able to, really, step into others' experiences or, in a more, what appears to be a more concrete way or
Mm-hmm.
materialistic way in a sense. But I mean, all of us have that ability. I can sit, most of us can sit with any other person and empathically, unless we're really, separated and in a lot of trauma or separation and pain. Any of us can sit with each other and pretty, to different, maybe different, sensitivities, experience each other, you know, suffering or happy, sense of, I
Yeah,
can't.
I mean, I don't know actually about that. Like I'm, very much reflecting on my dad's experience right now, right? So he has facing this sort of impossible choice of doing this surgery or not, and so I can sense his struggle with that choice. So I could say that's a struggle. That feels like an impossible choice, right? So I can feel a sense of like, what do I do though? I reference my own sense of what it would be like to be facing that choice. But I can't climb inside his skin
Mm-hmm.
and know what is the feeling of that for him. It's like if he jumps in the ocean, what does it feel like for him to swim in the ocean? I have no fucking idea.
Mm-hmm.
I only know what it feels like when I jump in the ocean. So that's my sense of it. It doesn't mean that there can't be a sense of sort of an appreciation of the challenge, even if I can't exactly know what it is. That's one way I would say, we could describe that as a kind of empathy. Like I can appreciate and feel the sense of like, wow, like that's big, it's huge, contemplating his own mortality. And but wow, I really don't know. I really don't know what it's like. And what's tricky is that no matter how much he might try to share it with me, and I'm constantly inviting that to him. And there's a beautiful, when we talk with one another about our experiences, there's a great beauty in that. And I also just have this appreciation of like, wow, I can't really get to the bottom of his experience any more than I can get to the bottom of my own experience of it. It's because it's fathomless. It doesn't have a bottom, Yeah.
Yeah, well, because to me, there's a good bit of arrogance in the idea that you can know someone else's experience.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, and because our experiences are all so unique, and
Absolutely.
for some reason, I had one of the things. My daughter hates cilantro, and I know there's a certain number of people for whom cilantro tastes like soap, and other people just love cilantro.
That's right.
And that it's a very, very small example, but the world is filled with those.
Yeah. And I appreciate your saying that. And I've been reflecting on this lately of how, like just to appreciate the way in which your own experience like nobody else knows it. And so whatever other people may be thinking about your experience and commenting on it and judging it, and it's like you have an intimacy with it that no one else has. And it's very powerful to see that, to remember that, recognize that even that idea of like I could possibly know like what another should do somehow. It's like that's hubris as well. Like how could I possibly know that? I don't. I just flat out don't know.
Yeah, I had a friend who had ALS, which is a
Hmm.
very difficult set of physical circumstances.
Hmm.
And I know she would always say, well, I don't want to do this. I don't want to ever have that. I'm not going to do these extreme measures. Well, when the time came, she had a different opinion.
Hmm. Hmm.
And, we let her, she got to have her opinion. And,
Hmm.
but, she really believed that she knew her own thoughts and what she was going to feel when the time came. And she didn't feel that way
Right.
when the time came.
Yeah. Right.
She didn't like the party, but she was not ready to leave the party. So
That's why our ideas about the future are always fantasies. They're always abstractions, right? We'll find out when we get there what our dance will be like, how we'll dance with, some event that we're concerned about, like what will happen if X, Y, or Z happens. It's just complete fantasy. Like we'll find out when we arrive there. Always. In real time, which is the only time we really have.
It's interesting that you said something, we can't know other people's experience, and then you added, well, I don't really know my own experience totally. And so what's the difference?
Well, I can't know what it is, I can't get to the bottom of what it is, but that doesn't mean that there's not experience being experienced. It's like the feel of water on my skin is a very specific experience, right? Taking a shower, swimming in an ocean or a lake or wherever, right? Like there's an experience of immersing the body in water, let's say. Now, if I investigate what that experience is sort of made of more fundamentally, I come up empty-handed. Like it doesn't resolve as something definable. That's what I mean by I can't ultimately know it. And yet it shows up as a very this is a very peculiar thing about life, which is that experiential phenomena show up as being something very specific. Like the taste, the flavor of a certain food is very specific. It's specifically that flavor. And it's specifically distinct from the specificity of other flavors. The flavor of a strawberry, very specific. Now, not every strawberry is distinct, but I'm using that category of phenomena. So, but then if you were to try to get to the bottom, and you know what it is, if I give you a strawberry, you know it intimately, and you have an experience of like the juiciness of it, the flavorfulness of it, very much, very concrete, very actual, and completely yours and no one else's, right? You're having that experience. Let's say you, the experiencer. It's ultimately life, but we'll say you. So, but to unpack that experience, to get to the nuts and bolts of what makes up that specificity that we call the taste of the strawberry, you can go down and down and down and down and down that rabbit hole and never come up with an answer to that question of what makes a strawberry taste like a strawberry as an experience. That's what I mean by you can't know it, but you can absolutely experience it. And you do whenever you have a strawberry. But you still don't know what the fuck it is, even though you experience it. And that's true of everything. You're having a very definite experience of being on a Zoom call right now. As to what that actually is, and it's your experience, and you can feel it. It's an actuality. But try to pin it down what it is, and that's the form. The specificity is ultimately formless and non-specifiable. You can't get to the bottom of it, and yet it shows up as something definite and specific. Indefinable that shows up as definability, apparently, or as beyond description that shows up as, again, a particular quality to it, a particular texture to it. That's, rough is not smooth. They're different textures, aren't they? But what is rough as an experience? Unpack it.
But even, we say rough as if it's one type of experience, yet each experience is unique.
Absolutely. It doesn't belong in a category because, you put your finger on this paper and it feels rough, and you put it even on the same paper and it's like you say, yep, it's still rough, but the experience is different, even if in the subtlest of ways. So in a sense, there's no single category of rough or smooth, because each event is completely stands on its own with no comparison, right? Because of the fluidity of life. So in a sense, I say categories of experience they're useful fictions, but they're fictions. There's nothing called rough or smooth. They don't exist. There's just what it is, which can't be categorized as rough or smooth, ultimately. Is that person a loud, a boisterous person, or they're a quiet, reflective, introverted person? Well, you can use those categories, but they're bullshit ultimately, because they just are how they are, and that's beyond categorization. Each of us is utterly beyond categorization, which is
And
incredible.
you can't really say it is, because it's already something else.
Right. And yet, the isness, the beingness, is very persistent. It's very continuous. Something always is, even if it's seemingly always disappearing and vanishing. It's persistent. The presence doesn't go away. Something always is. The beingness doesn't go away, as far as I can tell. And yet it's going away every instant. That's a paradox, but that's what it's like. Ever-present presence, as I call it. That always looks different. And yet is always here.
So isness is always here, but any particular thing is
Right. It's always got a different, it's always clothed differently. So and there's not an actual, if you investigate the isness, it doesn't really persist in terms of its apparent form and specificity, because it's too slippery. It's too, I guess it's too dynamic, it's too, but it's strange too, because it's like, in a way, the notion even of impermanence suggests that there's things that are impermanent, in other words, that don't have duration. But it's like it's even beyond that, because you can't find the things to be impermanent. So that's really trippy. Can't find the phenomena that are slipping away. That's pretty amazing.
so you just shut up, basically.
Or you can keep talking too, because that's wonderful too. It's all good. But yes, at a certain point, there's like, what can really be said? I remember one time when I was seeing that, like, in a very stark way, and it was just like, I felt like I could never ever say anything again. Like, it was absolutely nothing that could ever be said. And I thought, am I ever going to say anything ever again? So I wrote a book called Too Intimate for Words. It was my first book, because I'm a hypocrite.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I seem to enjoy it. So
You and Buddha.
yeah, right. The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao, And then the Tao, whoever wrote the Tao Te Ching, or I guess it was probably orally transmitted, went on to say a bunch of things about the Tao that cannot be said. So
Yeah. It was like Rumi or Meister Eckhart, one of them said the highest teaching is silence, and then let me talk for 20 more years.
right. Right. Yeah, it's like, and I'm very much like, my whole sense of this is it's radically inclusive of everything. So I don't have a tendency or proclivity to sort of privilege silence over sound, or stillness over motion.
Mm.
Those distinctions don't hold water for me.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. I mean, they're both beautiful, still what we might call stillness, but ultimately this transcends those categories again, as we were saying, Ed. You know, you can't, what do you mean still? What does that mean? It's like, where's the comparison? It's like this doesn't have a reference point, so you can't call it still or moving. It's beyond that.
So it's always the same, which means it's always changing.
Yeah. Yeah, and in a sense, it's just completely like both of those, you know, sort of like D, none of the above, you know, neither of those categories applies, you know,
Mhm.
and yet it's inclusive of all of those at the same
Mhm.
time. That's its beautiful, all-inclusive, you could say, kind of radical embrace of all of its apparent displays. You know, it can show up as something that we might characterize as more still
Mhm.
and more silent.
Mhm.
And it can show up as boisterousness and celebratory dancing, and it's very creative, isn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah, and we don't have to be concerned because it's showing up on its own.
It certainly seems to be doing it all by itself. Like, it's amazing if you just sit for a moment and do nothing, you know. Boy, there's a lot of stuff going on, isn't there? So there's something powering all of this and energizing all of this, it would seem, including what we think of as ourselves, which is really incredible thing to just feel that, you know, to feel the way in which, you know, feel the way in a sense of your own existence being generated in real time now, you know, somehow inexplicably, like your own consciousness. How is consciousness here? How is the knowing of this moment? What's generating that knowing? What's allowing that knowing to be here? Well, there's no answer to that, but it's something to feel that, in a sense, to feel the inexplicable origin of this moment, you know, in a sense, just feel the origin of this moment. Well, it's weird because you can't find the origin. The moment's just here. You can only abstract the origin. You can only abstract the beginning of this moment. You can't find the beginning because that you have to go to memory to find the beginning of this moment. Crazy, huh? Crazily beautiful somehow. And it's lovely to be with all of you. Thanks for joining me. Always great fun and very rich. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I'll be thinking of
Appreciate
you
it.
and your dad.
Thank you,
Hope your
Pam.
dad does okay.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Michael.
John,
Thanks, everyone.
Take good care, folks.
bye.